What up, everyone? This is Mr. Lord Dark Professor Dark Joker with this week's video. And this week, I'm going to give my predictions for the upcoming NBA season for 2025 and 2026. So I'm going to go over, who I think will make the playoffs in each conference, who I think will win each conference, and who will end up winning the NBA championship. So with all that being said, on with the video. First off, we'll go over who from the Eastern Conference I think will make the playoffs. So I think the 8 teams that will make it will be the Cleveland Cavaliers, New York Knicks, Indiana Pacers, Boston Celtics, Miami Heat, Philadelphia 76ers, Milwaukee Bucks, and Atlanta Hawks. So of course, Cavaliers, they were like, basically they were like the best team in the East last year during the regular season. I think a lot of that will continue, and I think they'll continue to be like a major player. The Knicks, of course, they've done well in recent years. They've obviously not been able to make it to the finals, but I think with some of the moves they made over the years, I think they'll continue to be a contender and will make the playoffs. The Pacers, of course, they made the finals last year, and I think they'll continue on that momentum and be a strong contender for this year. Boston Celtics, of course, the Celtics, most championships in NBA history. They generally have had one of the best rosters over the past few years. And I think they'll be pretty well. Of course, Miami Heat, Eric Spoelstra, who's now, I believe, like the Team USA coach. And, obviously, he's been one of the best coaches in the entire NBA, despite having not necessarily the greatest roster in the world. I think that coaching ability, I believe, will get him back to the playoffs this year. Of course, 76ers, you have Joel Embiid, trust the process. That process will lead them back to the playoffs. Milwaukee Bucks, of course, there's an issue with Giannis potentially being traded, and of course, if Giannis is there and playing, that will make the Bucks strong contenders. But if they get enough out of him with the trade, they could still end up being pretty strong contenders even with the trade without Giannis. And the Hawks, Trae Young being there, star player, and basically I think Young will be able to lead the Hawks back to the playoffs. Now for who I think from the Western Conference will make the playoffs. So I think we'll have the Golden State Warriors, of course, perennial contender with, Steph Curry, Steve Kerr, you know, Draymond Green and all that. So I mean, obviously, like, the Warriors are always gonna be strong contenders. That's not really gonna change for a while until a bunch of them start retiring. They're gonna be strong contenders. And of course, the Houston Rockets with Kevin Durant, that will be a big move. I think Durant will be able to at least get the Rockets to the playoffs. Denver Nuggets with Nikola Jokic, you know, perennial, MVP contender. The Nuggets, having a good team. I think they'll make it. OKC, of course, they won a championship last year. I think a lot of what the Thunder had last year, and as far as players and staff and all that, I think they've kept enough to where they'll be like a contender this year to make the playoffs. Dallas Mavericks with Kyrie Irving, and Mavs, it's a more questionable one as far as the ones, I guess, but I think of course, with Cooper Flag there, that is a big deal. From Duke, I think, I think the Mavs will be able to get back to the playoffs this year. Los Angeles Clippers with, James Harden. Honestly, they've underachieved a lot over the years. I mean, not as much as the Lakers have. But I think the Clippers will at least be able to make the playoffs this year. I don't know how far they'll make it, but I think they'll at least get in the playoffs. And Utah Jazz, the Jazz, they've been they got some good players. Basically, I think they have a decent enough staff to where they'll, you know, be like, I think they'll be able to like make some noise and I think they'll make some noise and be able to at least get into the playoffs with what they have. The Grizzlies, John Morant's able to stay out of trouble. Like the Grizzlies could be a really good team, and with a lot of what they have, you know, besides John Morant, I think I think they could still be a good enough team to potentially like make the playoffs this year. As far as who I think will win the Eastern Conference, I think it'll be the Boston Celtics. Obviously, they didn't win last year. Of course, it was the Indiana Pacers. I think the Celtics are going to rebound this year. You know, after last year when they kind of underachieved in that department of playoffs. So I think that the Celtics will, win the East this year to make it to the NBA Finals. For the Western Conference, I think it's going to be the Denver Nuggets, who are the Western Conference champions. Obviously, a lot of people are picking OKC to repeat. Understandable, they're a very strong contender, but I think with Jokic lean the Nuggets, I think they'll be able to rebound this year and make it back to the NBA Finals. As far as who I think will win the NBA Finals, I think it will be the Denver Nuggets. I think they'll beat the Boston Celtics and be able to get themselves Jokic another championship. I think it'll be an entertaining NBA Finals, but I think the Denver Nuggets will win out to and win the NBA championship. And that's it. Did y'all agree with my picks? Do you disagree with my picks? Whether you like this video, dislike this video, you can put all that in the comments. You can say, maybe say, hey, who you think is gonna win? You know, who you think is gonna make the playoffs? Put all that in the comments and all that. Like, share, subscribe, all that stuff, and look forward to the next video.